this is homicidal strangulation.
There was real fear. Women were having to look over their shoulder at night. Anyone in Porthmadog at that time could have been the killer.
It could be one person, or it could have been more than one.
And they suddenly announced that they had arrested a man, and soon came the dramatic development. It was someone within the community.
But the witness might have been mistaken in the identification of the person responsible. A lot of people believed that he was innocent.
Was there a serial killer on the loose in Porthmadog?
Nestled on the picturesque Glaslyn estuary in North Wales is the charming harbour town of Porthmadog.
Porthmadog is a coastal town. It had been in the 19th and 20th centuries a working port where slate from the North Wales slate mines were ferried to Porthmadog and from Porthmadog all over the world. It was famous for that.
Porthmadog has a population of about 5,000 people. It's a little Welsh town. It's the Welsh-speaking heartland of North Wales.
It's a lovely part of the world. It thrives on primarily tourism. It has a very close community where most people know everybody else. The majority of people that live in Porthmadog live there all their lives and don't move away.
Some people would still keep their front door unlocked. People were trusted, and it was the last place that you would expect such a dreadful event to happen.
It was one of my days off, visiting Liverpool, and it was in the afternoon that my phone rang. It was the control room inspector to tell me that a body had been found in Porthmadog and that units were at the scene and they believed that it was suspicious. Unfortunately, this was my worst nightmare regarding location because I was at least 3 hours drive away. But I was made aware that the helicopter was going to be in the area, and it was arranged that I drove to Prestatyn and jumped on the helicopter, which conveyed me to the scene.
The body of a woman has been found face down in a drainage ditch, known locally as the Cut.
The person had been walking along, seen the body in the water and raised the alarm. I was not informed of who she was because it was unclear at that time. All we know is that it was a young lady.
This cut, it's essentially a water-filled deep drainage ditch which has a certain degree of tidal current in it, washing in and out.
The location of the woman's body means that it is a race against time for the forensic team.
Your first concern with a body in these kind of circumstances is how much of the forensics is going to be lost.
If you've got a scene where there's running water, then you need to work expeditiously. There's a real kind of urgency to remove her body and take her body away from that water body so that we can recover evidence before it's been washed away.
The body was a crime scene, so you need the body out of there as fast as possible.
The crime scene manager, she informed me that a doctor had already been out and had pronounced the victim dead. And on turning over the body that was still in the water at that time, they'd found that a scarf was placed around her neck and that the end of the scarf had been forced down into her mouth.
Once the pathologist was able to inspect the body and see that there were features that were not in keeping with an accidental death, then that triggered a completely different track for the investigation. We're now in a possible murder situation.
This is homicidal strangulation. I mean, she wasn't suspended from anything. It wasn't self-suspension. There were injuries to the body, bruises. So it was quite clearly a homicide.
Also, that there was part of her clothing was disturbed, which it led us to believe that there was a sexual side of this attack. Identifying who the victim is naturally a priority, because we need to inform the relatives. We didn't know at that time whether the person was a local or someone there on a holiday. It was my suspicion, bearing in mind the location, and it was close to local housing, that it was unlikely to be a sort of tourist. It wasn't the tourist part of town, but we didn't know.
As police and CSI descend on the small seaside town, locals are becoming increasingly alarmed.
Word soon gets around. It really did shock the community. Something of this magnitude hadn't happened to a local girl that I can remember. And then obviously the police activity in the area became obvious to the locals, and this huge inquiry started.
I was informed that a brother had come to the cordon and raised the alarm that his sister was missing.
The young man who is concerned for his sister lives nearby.
Well, once her brother had come to the cordon and said that his sister was missing, and gave a description of his sister, which effectively matched the young lady that we'd found, officers dispatched to the house and questioned the family more in depth regarding identifying marks, tattoos, clothing, the general description of her. The information from the family is that their daughter had a tattoo, and when the body was examined, we found that tattoo on the body. The formal identification would come later, but we were as sure as you could be that we knew who it was.
The body is confirmed to be that of 22-year-old Ffion Wyn Roberts.
Ffion was a care worker. She also had another part-time job at the football club. She was a popular member of the community, kind, loving, she was described as. She had ambitions to join the army as a nurse.
And she lived in Porthmadog all her life. She was just a regular young lady. This is an open book at this stage. We wanted to know who she had been with that night. Had she travelled home alone? So the inquiries were in the locations that she'd been and the people that she'd been in with. Who was the last person that was seen with her, or we believed to be with her? So at this point, we're totally blind. We've only just found the body, we've only just found the family, so we had no information whether she'd been with anybody that evening, and we have to backtrack, in the first instance, at least 24 hours.
Just a few hours before her body was discovered, Ffion had been enjoying a night at the pub with her parents.
On the evening before, she'd been out celebrating with the family, and on a Saturday evening, had been doing what most young people do, socialising with friends in the town.
Fion's father is the first to go home, leaving Ffion and her mum drinking at a pub in nearby Tremadog. At around 2 a.m, Fion's mum returns home, and then 2 hours later, Ffion decides to make the short walk home alone.
At that time, in Porthmadog, I would hasten to say that the vast majority of people, if not all the people, felt extremely safe at walking around at night. And it was not unusual for young ladies to walk home and feel safe. And Ffion obviously felt safe enough to walk home on her own. Others had offered to go home with her, and she had decided no, she was safe enough, and she left for the journey home herself. So I think she was going home not having any worries at all, because at that stage I don't think people did in that small rural town.
This was the last time Ffion Wyn Roberts would be seen alive. In the town of Porthmadog in North Wales, police are investigating the murder of local woman Ffion Wyn Roberts.
In a small community like that, it is a major, major shock. From people who felt remarkably safe going about their day-to-day business, suddenly a horrendous crime like this has been committed in their local town.
Ffion's body has been found in a drainage ditch in a residential area.
Where the body was found was within a couple of 100 yards at the very most from her home address. She was nearly home.
It appears that Ffion has been strangled with her own scarf, and as pathologists examine the body, further alarming details start to emerge.
It's quite obvious this is homicidal ligature strangulation. The scarf was particularly tight around the neck with the knot on one side, and then from the knot it was the rest of the scarf that had been pushed into her mouth and throat. It may have been done by the assailant to stop her screaming or crying out. And she had all the changes associated with that. So, for example, she had obvious petechial hemorrhages, pinpoint-sized, tiny red hemorrhages. In the skin of the face, so you've got two components. You've got the compression effect around the neck of the ligature itself and the airway obstruction, both combining to cause asphyxiation.
As the post-mortem continues, it reveals the horrifying details of Ffion's last moments.
She was still alive when she went into that water. Now, she may well have been unconscious and dying from the ligature strangulation, but she was still breathing. There were breaths. You only have to inhale a few times or suck water into your lungs. My lungs were hyper-expanded, full of fluid. Cause of death was a combination of ligature strangulation and drowning.
Ffion had suffered a swift but brutal attack.
Ffion had injuries to the lips. There were bruises and laceration. Some of those may have been caused by direct punches to the lips. She also had bruises to her face, bruising to an eye, so she had definitely been struck by her assailant.
So unexpected was the attack that it seems Ffion did not have the chance to fight back.
So as a forensic pathologist, we'd always be looking for any injuries which suggest that the victim has fought off her attacker. Usually they'd be to the arms if someone is being attacked with a weapon, for example. In Ffion's case, there were no defensive injuries. Lack of defensive injuries suggests that maybe she was incapacitated very quickly, taken by surprise. So, did Ffion suffer? I think it was probably extremely quick, so she probably didn't know much about it.
As the days pass, pressure is mounting on Detective Superintendent Challoner and his team.
You've got to look at it with clear eyes, because the objective is to find the truth and to find the offender. Everybody that came into contact with Ffion for 24 hours, everybody in the pub, everybody that was out and about that night, and all those people are interviewed. So you're talking about hundreds of statements being taken. What we're trying to do is to identify everybody's movements at the relevant times in Porthmadog, because one or more of them was the offender.
Anyone in Porthmadog at that time could have been the killer.
It could be one person or it could have been more than one. We knew that a handbag was missing. So I am deciding on what is the priority about searching and expanding that search area, especially as this is a water flow and evidence may have moved down that.
And then there is a breakthrough.
That handbag was found by one of the search teams, but what I would describe as a sluice gates, which stops the estuary water coming in and flooding all these waterways. And what had been discovered there was a handbag and items of clothes. There was a set of trousers and there was a training shoe found. It is our belief that the offender had discarded them, hoping that the water in the estuary had washed them out and they'd never been recovered. But the person's aim hadn't been good and they'd been caught on the top of the gate and remained there.
Now all they had to do was find who wore them that night, who owned them. The police, they spoke to nearly 5,000 people in the area. They issued leaflets, they made appeals. They wanted to know who owned these items of clothing and the shoe.
But the police appeals for information regarding the owner of the clothes do not prove fruitful, so all hope lies with forensics.
So the process of examining the tracksuit bottoms is that we lay them flat onto an examination bench, and then we start to methodically recover any evidence that might be present. So that might include any body fluids, any DNA, and we're also looking on the surface for things like hairs and fibres. And in this particular case, that process recovered dog hairs from the clothing. So it's likely the owner of these tracksuit bottoms owns a dog. If we can recover DNA from it, and we then identify a dog that we think that hair might have originated from, we can take a small mouth swab from that dog, recover its reference DNA profile, and compare it to the hair that we recovered from the tracksuit bottoms.
And then the investigation turns in a direction that stuns the community in Porthmadog.
So often the answer to who murdered someone lies close to home.
Phone inquiries reveal Fion's brother had rung her 19 times in a short period of time on the night of her murder. Something which raised concerns due to their relationship.
There was much more than ordinary sibling rivalry between Ffion and her brother. There were long periods of time when they didn't get on.
On the night in question, her brother was drinking with friends in a car park. And police also focused on the whereabouts of Fion's father.
He had no alibi because he'd been to the same party as his wife and daughter, but had left early. So he left a pub called the Sportsman's at about 1 o'clock in the morning. So I was home by about 1:30, and so was a suspect in the sense that he had no alibi for the crucial few hours.
Less than a month after Fion's body had been found, her father and brother are arrested on suspicion of her murder.
And I made an appropriate decision to have them arrested so that they could be interviewed formally under caution.
Police in North Wales are investigating the homicide of 22-year-old Ffion Wyn Roberts. Items that detectives believe belong to the killer have been found, and Fion's brother and father remain in custody, arrested on suspicion of her murder.
It must have set tongues wagging in a small community. It must have been very difficult to live in Porthmadog at that time, knowing that questions were being asked. Were you responsible for what happened to Ffion?
But just days before Fion's funeral, having been interviewed at length by police, both are suddenly released.
The clothing, the trousers and the training shoe and Fion's bag, the forensic analysis and the DNA recovered from that did not match her brother or her father.
The police got back their DNA results. It wasn't Fion's brother. It wasn't Fion's father, it was someone else. It felt as though it was back to square one. There was pressure on the police to solve this crime. The councillor was even calling for a new investigation team at one stage. So there was real pressure to solve a seemingly random killing in a small town. There was real fear in the community. Women were having to look over their shoulder at night. They were being advised to not walk alone. Was there a serial killer on the loose? Was there a serial attacker on the loose? This was, a cause of major local concern.
Both locals and police are highly aware that a killer is still at large, and Detective Superintendent Peter Challoner has his own fears.
An offender goes on to offend again, and it is always a risk that if they get away with one crime, they'll commit another.
Desperate for the investigation to move forward, the police need help from the public.
We were still focused on finding out the person whose DNA we had found on those clothes. We were able to offer a reward of £10,000 for information leading to the offender. A local businessman had offered to pay half the reward.
1 month after her death, Fion's funeral is held at Capel Salem, Porthmadog.
500 people turned up at her funeral, shops closed. There was support for her family, her devastated family in this hour of need and grief.
As Fion's community grieve her loss, the investigation into her murder continues.
We weren't getting a lot of success from our appeals. We weren't getting closer to the individual responsible. And one of the aspects of an inquiry like this is that we try to make best use of the media.
There's a need to keep the public interest in what had happened in Porthmadog to try and catch the killer. TV, press, radio, newspapers came down. This was everyone's worst nightmare, and the killer was still at large somewhere. And the police felt that the answer lay in the local community, that they would find the killer somewhere in the Porthmadog area.
And because of that broadcast, there was a woman in South Wales contacted the major investigation team and told us that 20 years previously, when she was in Porthmadog, there was a similar attack in the same area.
The attack 2 decades earlier had happened just yards from the location that Fion's handbag had been found.
A young lady had left her place of work and saw a man apparently molesting a woman, and she shouted to him and he ran away.
Quite an astonishing development in the case. This woman had come across another woman in broad daylight who was crying and seemingly about to be attacked with a stone. This was a key evidence for the police. The eyewitness knew this local man. She named him. Checking back through the records, police are able to see that a court case had been held in the local magistrate's court for assault. A man had been fined, ordered to pay compensation.
The man connected to the attack in Porthmadog 20 years previously is 55-year-old local factory worker Iestyn Davies.
Once the name came in, together with the history of what he was alleged to have done 20 years previously, that was a very similar set of circumstances to the attack on Ffion, and plus it was in the same location. So immediately he became a person of interest. A plan was put together to arrest him and to retrieve his DNA.
11 weeks after the discovery of her body, Iestyn Davies is arrested on suspicion of the murder of Ffion Wyn Roberts.
For the family, this must have been a relief, for the finger was at last not being pointed in their direction.
News of the arrest sends shockwaves through the tiny Welsh town.
You might have expected whoever was responsible to have been a stranger who was visiting this small town in Gwynedd. Not Iestyn Davies, a man who was brought up in the area. He lived nearby. He was hiding in plain sight.
He lived certainly all of his adult life in that community, and he was very well known. And there were people who, for example, had played games with him, either darts or football. At the time, he was working at a wood factory, and that was local to the area, very close to where things happened.
Iestyn Davies lived near the family. He knew Ffion, and it came as a real shock to the community that someone within Porthmadog could be accused of such a grave act, such an awful, dreadful killing.
He was arrested, his DNA was taken, a police rider was on hand to escort that forensic example of his DNA to the lab. They did an examination and reported back that we had a match. The match of that DNA was from the sample inside Ffion's bag.
So once that DNA was recovered from the handbag, it generated a match to Iestyn Davies's DNA profile. And the way that we convey that match was that it's a 1 in a billion. So what that means is it's 1 billion times more likely that the DNA originated from Iestyn Davies than it did an unrelated individual. And so the opinion was given that the DNA was transferred as a result of him having handled that handbag.
The case was starting to come together.
When I had identified Davies, we found out that he had a dog. So when he was arrested, there was a hair sample taken from his dog, which again went to the lab. We had recovered dog hairs from Fiona on her clothes, and we were able to do a DNA match, and that brought us back about a 2% accuracy that the dog hairs were attributed to his dog, and again we had a match.
Iestyn Davies is charged with the murder of Ffion Wyn Roberts. But Detective Superintendent Challoner knows that there is one major flaw in his evidence.
The defence will make great play that the police haven't brought forward an eyewitness. Well, there isn't one. That's a fact of life. You can't manufacture an eyewitness. If no one was there, you don't have one. But of course, the defence will highlight the point that no one was there, no one's seen it.
The police inquiries relied more on technology and science than they did on looking for witnesses. There was a suspicion in Porthmadog that the killer was not Iestyn Davies. He was known to the community and not generally known to have a violent disposition, and so a lot of people believed that he was innocent.
And for people in Porthmadog, there was still a sense of fear. Had the police got the right man?
Nearly 12 months after the body of Ffion Wyn Roberts was found in a drainage ditch, the man accused of her murder, Iestyn Davies, is to stand trial.
The vast courtrooms. There was a tense atmosphere. This was a real human tragedy, a young woman with a whole life ahead of her that was cut so short. And Throughout the trial, Iestyn Davies was pointing the finger at Fion's brother.
Iestyn Davies wasn't an immediate suspect, and he wasn't arrested for some time. We raised the suspicion that her brother was a suspect, had been a suspect, and our view, as we put it, was that he was still a suspect.
Despite their early arrests, the prosecution maintained that Fion's brother and father played no part in Fion's murder.
They were released after those interviews, and in the fullness of the inquiry, we eliminated them as responsible in any way. They were purely victims, and they had no responsibility for their sister and daughter's death.
The prosecution puts to Iestyn Davies evidence that links him to the tracksuit bottoms and trainer, items they believe belonged to the killer.
Prosecution case was based very much on there being this important evidence of the tracksuit bottoms, and they'd been found in a sluice gate near to Fion's handbag and near to a muddy trainer. And the mud, the prosecution said, was from when her body had been put in the ditch. And there was also DNA evidence.
The discovery of Iestyn's DNA on the discarded clothing is compelling, but the defense are able to offer an explanation.
The tracksuit bottoms were accepted by Iestyn Davies to have been his. He gave an account of having washed them at work and hung them up on a fence, and they had disappeared. Now, there's a logic in that, because where they were found was quite close to where he said he'd hung them up to dry, and so that was credible.
However, it is revealed that Iestyn Davies' DNA was also found on Fion's clothes.
He gave as an explanation for that he had seen her on the Friday night at the station public house, and that he'd given her a hug.
So if an individual gives an account in which they have been in legitimate contact with someone before the attack, we have to consider what is the chances, or what is our expectation of DNA transferring in that setting. And obviously, if I hug someone, my DNA could transfer.
The prosecution are quick to offer their rebuttal.
Two witnesses were called to say that we've known Iestyn for many years, and we don't think he's a hugging sort of person, and that he didn't know Ffion well enough that he would have spontaneously hugged her on seeing her.
The defence know that the eyewitness evidence from the historic assault in Porthmadog may be harder to explain away.
The difficulty that we had with the evidence of the previous incident is that the person said that the attacker had held a rock in his hand, and the body of Ffion Roberts was found to have had a head injury consistent with having been hit with a blunt object, and that could have been a rock. So that would then become, in the prosecution's perspective, a weapon of choice.
Nonetheless, Iestyn's defence team raise a simple concern that casts a shadow of doubt over the eyewitness testimony.
The witness might have been mistaken in the identification of the person responsible.
The prosecution reveal their most damning evidence so far when they present to the jury CCTV of Iestyn Davies on the morning of Fion's murder. He appears to be wearing the tracksuit bottoms the police believe were worn by the killer.
It was a matter of capturing him on CCTV, capturing his movements to the scene where we believe that she was killed at the relevant time to where the attack happened on Ffion. And at that time, he had with him his dog. We then capture him going back to the premises he was staying at. He changes clothes, and then he's captured going in the direction of the sluice gates. He then, after a short period of time, goes back to the premises where he's staying. What's most significant is in the first part of that journey, where we believe he attacked Ffion, he is wearing the Adidas tracksuit bottoms with the stripes down the side, and when he goes back to his home and then he leaves, he is in a different set of clothing. So we believe he committed the crime, he went home, he changed and took all his clothing and his shoes, went down to the sluice gate and tried to discard them.
The CCTV evidence places Iestyn Davies in the vicinity of Fion's murder around the time she is believed to have died. But Davies claims this walk in the early hours is far from unusual.
He gave explanations for that, which were very early in the morning. He had a dog, Meg, who didn't let him sleep in, and the dog woke him early, and he went out walking the dog. The police asked him about the change of clothes, and he readily acknowledged that he had changed, but said that was often his habit. He'd go out for a very early morning walk in whatever was first to hand when he got up, but then he changed into what would be day clothes later on.
In the dock, Iestyn Davies seems unfazed by proceedings.
He was full of himself in there. He was an expressionist, cocky.
He was cool, he was calm. This was a man who wasn't buckling under the pressure of intense questioning. Iestyn Davies was almost laughing at the law. There was a telling moment when he said, "I'm enjoying this." This was during his cross-examination, which was quite shocking to those in the courtroom at the time. And don't forget, we were talking about the most horrendous murder of a young woman. It painted a chilling or sinister outline of the true character of the man. A man who seemed unfazed by what he was being accused of. He was so devious. He was a man who hadn't panicked, who smirked while being questioned about a murder of a young woman.
But the prosecution have evidence that they believe will wipe the smile from Iestyn Davies' face.
There was DNA found in the knot of Ffion's scarf, which was used to strangle her and gag her.
And because the DNA was inside the knot, it suggests that it belongs to the person who tied the ligature.
You have to remember that this person was found in a water body, so that there's a risk that it's going to remove some evidence. But the fact that we've got this knotted part of the scarf means that it would have been protected. It's a forensic goldmine. So DNA is this kind of silent witness.
And the DNA is a match to Iestyn Davies.
All this evidence was pointing towards Iestyn Davies. The story of her brother being the real killer, it all seemed to be becoming something of a red herring. He wasn't the clever killer that he perhaps thought he was. He was concocting lies, and his story was starting to fall apart under scrutiny.
After 6 weeks of evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict.
We had no expectation of a result going one way or the other. There might have been a conviction, there might have been an acquittal. I stopped looking in the crystal ball many years ago. We have no idea which way a jury is going to go, and every time is a mystery.
Tensions in court are running high when, after several days of deliberation, the jury are unable to agree on a verdict.
The judge brought them back in, and they said they couldn't unanimously come to a verdict, and he gave them the option of a majority verdict.
The jury had been out for some days, and I think for many of us, we were reaching the stage, is this going to be a retrial?
Now, once they'd been given that opportunity to bring back a majority verdict, it wasn't so long after that that they actually returned.
By a majority verdict of 10-2, Iestyn Davies is found guilty of the murder of Ffion Wyn Roberts.
And sentence was the only one to be expected. That was life imprisonment, with a recommendation of 25 years. That means that the defendant cannot even be considered for parole until he's been in custody for 25 years.
He probably thought all that evidence was going to be washed away in the Irish Sea, never to be found by the police. But thankfully, justice prevailed.
Iestyn Davies was remarkably stoical about it. There were no tantrums, no outbursts. He knew that he was possibly going to be convicted, and that possibility turned into a reality.
My theory is that Ffion had come face to face with Davies. He started making advances, and when she rejected those advances, he committed the act that he did.
The sentence comes as a huge relief to Fion's family and the community of Porthmadog.
They were a well-known family and a respected family. They were liked and it's admired because they were all hard-working people, and the community felt very strongly that they'd suffered a great loss.
In a final cruel twist, it transpires that Iestyn Davies had visited the family home just days after he had killed Ffion.
And it really did add to the agony of the Roberts family. They'd lost their daughter in these most terrible circumstances, and then have the killer turn up at their home, comforting them. This was a truly grotesque thing for anyone to do.
For Fion's family, friends and neighbours in Porthmadog, the loss of one of their own continues to cut deep.
It caused huge upset. It was going to take time for the people to get over what had happened to this well-liked girl.